people lose their jobs. I mean, there's a guy on Manx Radio, I think, lost his job because he uttered the phrase, "all lives matter." I mean, this is preposterous.
To get Brexit done.
Make America great again.
No, no, no.
This is Stephen Edginton for The Sun, and today I'm interviewing Iain Dale. Iain Dale is an LBC host and a political commentator. He has also written the book, Why Can't We All Just Get Along? We're going to be talking all about his book, wokeness and the current political climate and the media. Iain Dale, thank you so much for joining us.
Pleasure.
Why can't we just all get along?
Because we're human beings. That's the simple explanation. We all have emotional reactions to things, and sometimes when we're in an argument and someone says something we don't like, we overreact, and the internet has exacerbated that. Twitter in particular, if someone insults you, your natural human reaction is to immediately type out an insult back, and it escalates from there. And this has always happened in a way, but I think society has changed so much in the last 20 or 30 years, where we've seen the almost total disappearance of deference. When I was young, my parents would always use that hackneyed old phrase, well, you've got to respect your olders and betters. We don't think like that anymore. We put everybody on the same platform, almost regardless of their age. And there might be some people that you look up to, that you defer to, but generally people have lost the habit of deferring. Now, that's not a bad thing in many ways. I think we did live in a society, particularly maybe in the early part of the 20th century, where we were used to tugging our forelocks. Sort of the working classes would see the Duke coming down the road and sort of take their hats off and all the rest of it. That wouldn't happen now. You find even with the royal family, people are rather reluctant to bow or curtsy in the way that they would have done before. Now, I don't think that's a bad thing necessarily, but it does mean that people are far more willing to say things to each other in a way that they wouldn't have imagined doing so many, many years ago.
Is this just all on social media? Because Twitter, as you write in your book, amplifies people's strong emotions, and you said, for example, if you looked on election day in 2019, it looked like a Labour landslide, but in fact it was the opposite way around.
Well, we have to understand that Twitter does not reflect wider society, and that's a really good example of where you can get a very false impression of Twitter. But I think more generally, society has developed, the media has developed, politics has changed. For example, interviewers now are likely to be far more rude to politicians than they would have been 30 years ago. I mean, Robin Day was the first one to start this, who, for anyone under the age of, 40 or 50, they probably don't know who Robin Day is, but he was the Jeremy Paxman of his day. He started out at ITN as a newsreader, and then he became a really forensic interviewer. Very entertaining, actually, in many ways, but he was the first one to just cut any form of deference from a political interview. There's some famous clips of interviewers interviewing Harold Macmillan or Clement Attlee back in the 1950s. There's an interview with Clement Attlee, and the interviewer says, "Is there anything else you'd like to say, Mr. Attlee?" Mr. Attlee says, "I don't think so." And I mean, that would never happen nowadays. And I'm not saying it should happen, but over the years, I think the attitude of interviewers has changed, and it's partly because editors, whether it's newspaper editors or broadcast editors of the programmes, they are desperate for a newsline. And if you're presenting a programme, I don't know, like the Today programme, where you're doing a 4 or 5 minute interview with a politician, there's that, you haven't got an editor necessarily shouting in your ear, get a newsline, but the interviewer knows that their reputation depends on getting newslines more or less every day, particularly on a programme like that. So therefore, the interviewer goes into the interview, all guns blazing. "So, Minister, aren't you ashamed of what you've done? Aren't you going to resign today?" What happens then? The politician, believe it or not, is a human being, and if someone shouts at you, immediately your defences go up, the shutters go up. So what the politician does then is utter the sound bites that he's or she has been pre-programmed to utter by the spin doctors. So you get this perfect storm of nothing. And then the listener at home is the one that's shortchanged because they get nothing out of it at all. Whereas in longer form interviews, which we used to have lots of on the media, Sunday lunchtime political programmes, it wasn't Sunday morning then, it was Sunday lunchtime, both on the BBC and ITV, politician would be grilled for up to an hour. Where do you see that now? It's only on podcasts. And that's where the internet has actually been a good thing, because it's allowed interviewers to really do what they want to do, because most interviewers would like to do longer interviews, and it's allowed politicians to explain themselves, explain their arguments in a way that you just can't do in a 5-minute newsy type interview. So I actually feel really sorry for high profile interviewers, particularly I think on the BBC, because the BBC is damned if they do and damned if they don't in many ways. And I would love to get away from this obsession with the viral clip. And I mean, look, LBC has partly made its name through the viral clip. James O'Brien became a star in many ways because of his monologues, which went viral on Brexit. And we have managed to recruit an army of younger listeners through this. So Radio 4 and Radio 5 Live are obsessing about how do they get a younger audience, and they do these horrible sort of tokenistic programs and get presenters who actually, they think because they are young and cool and hip, they will relate to a younger audience. Actually, they don't at all. So we have got a higher listenership now in the 15 to 24 age group than most music stations, which is incredible when you think about it. So we've already got that next generation to come up, and our average listening age is slightly lower, well, it's vastly lower than Radio 4, but also lower than 5 Live. And in a way, it's partly the political environment that we live in, where the issues that are being discussed, contrary to popular opinion, younger people were absolutely interested in Brexit on both sides of the argument. The coronavirus crisis, I think, has also been something that has brought people to speech radio, maybe in a way that other things hadn't before.
There's a lot to unpack there. Obviously, we talk about social media, traditional media, radio stations, and you could classify those all as being sort of the part of the public discourse. Do you think people, ordinary people sitting at home who are apolitical or just may read a newspaper once in a while, don't really care about the news too much, not like us do, do you think ordinary people have got more polarised and more partisan, and do you think their discourse as a human being has got worse over the last 50 years?
First of all, I hate this phrase, ordinary people. Do you know anybody that would think or say, yeah, I'm ordinary? I mean, most people are not actually ordinary. I know what you mean by the phrase.
Apolitical, that's
yeah,
what I mean. People
but
aren't in the bubble.
most people are not obsessed by politics. They are generally vaguely interested in the news, and particularly if something big is happening, they will switch news programmes on. But they won't consume it in the same way that you or I do. They might. I mean, obviously, newspapers are sort of becoming less popular as younger gen. If you go into a media studies class now in a university and say, who bought a newspaper this morning, you might get one hand go up. Now, when I was at university age, virtually everybody would have bought a newspaper. And so obviously the newspaper sector is having to cope with that, and obviously doing a lot more online, just what you're doing today, to make sure that people still relate to the newspaper brand. Now, it is a little easier, I think, for broadcasters. But how many 21-year-olds today watch the BBC 10 o'clock news? We get a lot of 60-year-olds watching the 10 o'clock news because that's what they've been brought up to do. People are changing their media habits, and I think all sorts of different types of media are struggling to cope with that. I think radio has adapted. I mean, I suppose I would say this, wouldn't I? But I do think radio has adapted far more than maybe other forms, where you've got certainly speech radio stations like LBC now, everything is being visualised. That doesn't mean that we're turning ourselves into a TV station, although sometimes you could be forgiven for wondering. I never thought I would be reading an auto cue on a radio programme, which I was doing last night on my cross-question programme. But that is to get these clips, because people aren't going to listen necessarily for 30 minutes, but they will listen to a 2-minute clip. And that, as I say, brings in a new audience. It helps you retain the audience that you've got because they can see that you're innovating. And that's what, in a sense, everything, it's not just media that has to do this, the whole of society is having to innovate.
I suppose I want to get to the nub of the issue about, you know, the decline of public discourse, which is basically what your book is about, and you try to sort of you try and sort of analyse that and understand it and come up with some solutions. But I want to maybe throw a different hypothesis back at you and say perhaps what we see as the decline in public discourse is simply the things that you've mentioned in terms of media outlets projecting a small minority of very vocal voices who have become extremely partisan due to issues such as Brexit and Donald Trump and lots of things like that. And then social media, as I mentioned before, it's not the real world. We're on it all the time, and it may seem to us that people are very angry and bitter, but in reality, let's say the vast majority of people aren't really like that. So what would you say to that argument, that perhaps it's just media outlets trying to get a soundbite, and Twitter is basically engulfing us and deluding us into thinking that everyone hates each other, whereas in actual fact, we all rather get along okay?
Well, there is something to that, and most people do get on okay. But I think what's happened is that the advent of the internet has been really brilliant in one way and really bad in another. The way that it's brilliant is that it's given ordinary people a voice, which they just didn't have before. And I say in the book, if you're Mrs. Miggins from 32 Acacia Avenue, in 1995, if you had something to say, your only opportunity to say it really was writing a letter to your local newspaper. You might have gotten a local radio phone in occasionally, and that was it. Whereas with the advent of blogging in 2003, 2005, suddenly people who had websites which were very awkward, and unless you were a technical person, you couldn't update yourself. You had to send something to someone else to update it for you. Suddenly, with the advent of blogs, that it all changed. And I can remember going on a trip to Washington in 2002, and this guy said, "Oh, do you want to see my blog?" And I said, "What's the blog?" So he showed me it, and it was like a light bulb going off in my head, thinking, "This is amazing, I want one." And he said, "Okay, I'll set you up." 10 minutes later, I was blogging. And it was a revelation. And Guido Fawkes, Tim Montgomery at Conservative Home, and me, we were kind of the first movers in political blogging in this country. I mean, if you have first mover advantage, that really is quite something. And that's, in a way, though I had done quite a bit of media before that, that is, I suppose, how I made my name. Now, I wasn't alone in that. There were lots of people who saw, "Oh, he's got a blog, oh, I think I'll do that." And so you got lots of other political blogs. You then got very localised blogs. Someone would blog about what's happening in their local village or town. And so Mrs. Miggins had a ready-made audience. And that was great for Mrs. Miggins. But then you had the very dark Mr. Miggins coming along, who had evil intents, and he would start writing terrible things about people, maybe just as a comment on a blog. And so this gave well-intentioned people a real opportunity to put their views out there, but it also gave very bad people the chance to vent their spleen. And then Twitter, when that came along, and it wasn't really, in the first few years of Twitter was seen as a sort of fairly benign place. And I genuinely didn't really get it initially. I remember doing a panel with someone, I think it was Duncan Campbell, and he literally tweeted every 2 minutes of his life. I just thought, why would anyone be interested in you? I mean, I don't know you. Why would I be interested in what your train journey was like or what you had for breakfast? So, though I registered my name because I didn't want anyone else to use it, I didn't really use Twitter for a couple of years. But once I worked out what I could use it for, which is essentially, and it sounds very pretentious, but to promote the brand Iain Dale and my radio show and all the other things I do, then I could see the point of it. But it was only, I think, probably 2013, 2015, where the abuse really started, to the extent that nowadays, and it's probably because I have a lot more followers than I did then, I don't know. But nowadays, if I hit the headlines for any reason, whether I said something interesting, good or bad, sometimes I can't look at my own Twitter feed for 2 days because it is just infested by people who want to shout abuse. And it shouldn't be like that. And Twitter, I think, have a responsibility to do something about that, but they seem incredibly reluctant. They could stop all of this bot activity if they really wanted to. I mean, I have a West Ham football blog, West Ham Till I Die, for anyone interested. People have to sign up to that to comment. I can filter out all of the sort of bots or whatever, so why can't Twitter? They just don't seem, they think it would change the nature of it. Well, good, because it needs to change. And I've got to the point now where if I wasn't on the radio, if I didn't do all this sort of stuff, I don't think I would bother with Twitter any longer. I had 48 hours a few weeks ago where I boycotted Twitter. I can't even remember what the issue was now. But I just thought, okay, I'll go along with this. So for 2 days I didn't tweet. I did look at it, but I didn't actually tweet. And I thought that I would really miss it, and I didn't. And I sort of look forward to the day when I don't really have to do Twitter in the way that I do now. I mean, most people say, yeah, right, there's no way you'll be able to wean yourself off that particular addiction, because it is an addiction. And all addictions are bad, and that one certainly is.
It's interesting you talk about regulating Twitter, and this is something in your book that I found, I would say, interesting, this idea of regulating social media companies. It's a really, in my view, very difficult line to go down.
I don't think I did say that. I don't think I said I actually think it's impossible for a single country to regulate anything on the internet. If you were to do it, it would have to be an international agreement.
Okay, well,
but I don't think I really.
Let's not go far as to say the word regulate. Let's step back slightly. You said that Twitter has a responsibility to prevent hate speech. Yeah. Facebook has a responsibility to prevent fake news going on its platform. You talked about adopting German laws. I forget about something to do with Twitter. And so it seems that, and you also said to lobby the US government to put pressure on Facebook and Twitter to stop hate speech and fake news. That was. Am I right? Am I characterising that correctly?
You are, but that's not regulation. I mean, that is encouraging companies to do the responsible thing. And okay, in the end.
But what is my question is, what is fake news? What is a bot? What is hate speech? Who decides these things? Because if you go to someone like Owen Jones, he would call me a fascist, Nazi, or people on the far left would call anyone who's any conservative a Nazi or hate speech or a bot or anything. Do you see what I mean? So there's a bit of a problem there.
I know exactly what you mean. And this is where these social media platforms, they deny that they're publishers, but they are publishers. In the same way that my book is published by HarperCollins, my Twitter feed is published by Twitter. They own it. So now I don't expect Twitter to monitor every tweet as it goes up necessarily. It's just impossible to do. You literally have to have millions of people doing that. Well, that's clearly impossible. But they could actually monitor things in a much better way than they do at the moment. I mean, you can report things, but there are so many examples of egregious hate speech on Twitter that they don't do anything about. I think fake news is actually much more difficult to do because you are making a very subjective judgment there. But again, that's what editors have to do every day of the week. All journalists are subject to that. And in a sense, if you are promulgating news on a social media platform, there is a journalistic aspect to what you're doing. Now, I don't think Facebook have got it right on that because they do seem to be taking a very liberal stance on that, and there's so many examples of people on the right who've been stifled. I mean, I just don't think it's acceptable for Facebook to, or even Twitter, to censor the President of the United States. I mean, he says some terrible things, and I completely agree that they're terrible. But is it really the role of somebody to do that to an elected politician? I'm not sure it is. I think sometimes you have to respect the fact that your viewers or listeners or people on social media, they do actually have a brain and that they can actually work out whether someone's talking rubbish or not, or being evil in intent or not. But that's different from an ordinary member of the public who's been elected to nothing, who just decides, I hate Stephen Edginton and I'm going to bring him down and I'm going to accuse him of all sorts of different things. Well, there are laws to cope with that, the laws of libel and slander, but that's where a media platform comes in. I mean, people wouldn't be able to get away with that in the mainstream media, so why should they be able to get away with that in social media terms? And I don't think any of the whether it's Facebook, Twitter, I mean, Instagram is a bit different. That seems to be a sort of almost peaceful compared to other platforms, mostly, I think. I mean, I don't really do Instagram a huge amount, but I don't think I've ever seen anyone on Instagram lose their rag or write really vicious things. I'm sure they have, but I just haven't seen it. So it's a bit like coronavirus. I mean, we all have to be responsible for our own actions. And people can say, well, it's the government's responsibility to do this, that, or the other. Well, to an extent, they're right. But you've got to also say it's Facebook's responsibility, it's Twitter's responsibility as well. But in the end, we have to be responsible for our own behaviour, whether it's on social media or anywhere else. We have to be responsible for our own behaviour as we walk down the street, things we say to each other. But of course, at the moment, people are far more willing to say things on social media to each other in a way that they wouldn't necessarily do face to face, although even that, I think, is changing.
I don't want to confuse the issues of fake news and hate speech anyway, because they're completely different things, and there's interesting nuance there. And I love the idea of, regulating yourself and taking personal responsibility for what you say online. Of course, I'm sure that's totally right.
And in a sense, that is stating the bleeding obvious that people should do that. But I've had so many people get in touch with me saying, your 50 ways to improve public discourse at the end of the book. That's actually really made me think about how I behave, what I do. And in a sense, that was the whole point of the book, to actually make people a bit more introspective about what they do, and to suggest that, well, if someone insults you, don't immediately respond. Think about it a bit. Take 20 seconds. Don't instantly press send on some more abusive tweet that you've sent. And it is trying to almost combat your own natural instincts. And we regulate ourselves in a work environment. We regulate ourselves to an extent with friends, or we probably need to regulate ourselves a bit more when we're talking to people that have shown dislike, hate towards us.
So if I took that argument to what I would call its logical conclusion, surely then it's not up to Facebook or Twitter or the government to regulate what we say on social media, but it's up to ourselves. And if someone else shares a bit of fake news or is hateful to me, I can report them, I just might ignore the fake news. But it should be up to individuals to make a decision on that, how they respond to, let's say, your mother or your grandfather or your friend sharing something that you think is false, or if someone sends abuse to you on Twitter, you should obviously be able to report that or whatever. So surely it's up to the individual rather than to the company or to a government to regulate that.
In general, I would agree with that, but I think there are nowadays quite a few exceptions. You look at these deepfake videos, for example, which, we all find memes quite funny, and people can make very funny memes about Joe Biden or Donald Trump, and we'll all have a good laugh. But when it is something that is designed to damage someone politically, it's not satire, it's not humour, it is someone deliberately going out to falsify a video to make you think that this person has said something that they haven't. And it's entirely convincing because of the way that you can use video now, as you well know. I mean, it enables people to do this very, very easily. And I remember seeing a video not that long ago which confirmed my own views and prejudices, I suppose. And my instant reaction was, I'll retweet that. And then there was this little voice saying, don't do that until you're sure that it's actually a genuine video. And it wasn't. I wish I could remember what it was. And that was a good lesson. And I'm sure there are lots of other things that I've wanted to tweet that I haven't, because you can't spend half an hour researching something to make sure that it is actually valid. And of course, Photoshop pictures are exactly the same. But where do you draw the line? That is my problem here. In that where you might draw the line will be different to where I would draw the line. It would be different to where Facebook would draw the line. And there are examples of hateful things that people say, which I think Twitter should then ban or suspend and account for. But they decide not to, or their algorithm tells them not to. And that's the problem, that a lot of these things are actually run through an algorithm. So I'm not pretending that I or anyone else has got the answer to this. But I still do believe that most social media companies have not got it right, and they need to devote an awful lot of time and money to making sure that they improve how they're doing it.
Let's talk about wokeness. Let's talk about Black Lives Matter. That's been a huge, huge issue. I've done so many interviews on that this year, with George Floyd's death, and then the protests and the riots and everything like that. And then there's been this huge public conversation, that's what they call it, about racism, with people like the BBC chiming in and statues coming down and everything like that. So can I just get your overall, very general take on how that has impacted public discourse this year?
I think it has made people, in some ways, reevaluate maybe previously held views. I think the riots, I didn't agree with the pulling down of the statue. The protests I thought shouldn't have been allowed to happen because of COVID. If you remember, it was at the height of the infections. And I think, but nothing was done. The police just turned a blind eye to what was going on. And although the protests, and there was violence in them, that was only right at the end and in a relatively small way in one of them, maybe more in another.
In America, are we being clear about that?
No, I'm not being clear about that. I'm saying that in the UK.
Okay,
as
sorry.
well.
Yeah, sure.
And I think that it was very good that we started talking about these issues. What became clear to me was that I didn't know enough about empire. And that's not to say that I think now that all of our empire history was bad. I don't. But there were things that happened that we should talk about. But on the other hand, we have talked about slavery. Slavery is taught in schools. And I think we got to a point in the conversation where if you made any defence of the empire at all, and actually even listed some of the good things that Britain did, and if you said, well, we can't judge people's behaviour in 1754 by the same standards as we judge people's behaviour today, I mean, you were drummed out of the brownies. And but it did make me think a bit about my own attitudes, and I will always remember when I got a call. I can't remember what the subject of the hour was. I got a call from a woman, Denise in Enfield, who accused me of seeing everything through my white privilege. Well, I didn't take that very well, and we had quite a sparky exchange. And she was very eloquent, and started talking about, well, the fact that LBC has only got, at that point, one non-white presenter and only one woman presenter. And I said to her, well, actually, we've now got two, because Rachel Johnson has joined. And she said, yeah, I wonder how she got through the front door, being the Prime Minister's sister. And she said, I wouldn't get through the front door. And I thought, do you know what, you're probably right. And I've always been conscious of the fact that if you send your CV into a company and your name is Undabaningi, you are less likely to get an interview than if your name is Stephen. And that is wrong. I mean, that is, in most cases, unconscious bias. So I said to her, okay, we'll come and co-present the programme tomorrow then. Because I just sort of, there was something that in her that I thought, actually, you could be quite good at this if you were ever given the chance. And to cut a long story short, she then came and did some programmes with me, and she's now been given a contract by LBC. Now, some people will say, oh, well, you're just being tokenistic because you know you've got to improve your sort of ethnic minority numbers. You don't get on a national radio station just because of the colour of your skin. You actually have to be well, you either have to be good at it, or you have to show the potential to be good at it. And Denise is sort of like halfway in a sense. So, and I don't think there are many other presenters that would have done this, because I just sort of got her in and I kind of sat back for the hour and let her prove herself. It's not my decision whether she gets a contract or not, but clearly she impressed people sort of further up the food chain than me. And I think she brings a really refreshing new voice to the station. So, and I think everybody has to really look at not saying, oh, well, there are 13% of ethnic minority people in the country, therefore 13% of our staff have to be non-white. I don't think that's the way that you go. But I do think that we should all be making much more efforts to recognise that there's a lot of talent out there that is being wasted. If you're not given an opportunity, you'll never know how good someone will be. So, although I do not support the organisation Black Lives Matter UK, I can't support an organisation that wants to defund the police. And they sometimes deny that they want to do this, but again, yesterday I see they've issued another statement saying that's exactly what they want to do. I can't support an organisation that wants to overthrow capitalism. And there's various other parts of their platform that I'm really uncomfortable with. So I can support the concept of Black Lives Matter, absolutely. Surely anyone, any decent person would. But I'm not going to kowtow to an organisation that is at least pseudo-Marxist, if not Marxist. And I think we have all, to an extent, slightly got this wrong, and you're now in a situation where you have to walk a verbal tightrope, and one word out of place, and I can't use the word I was about to use, and a storm of abuse will descend on you, and people lose their jobs. I mean, there's a guy on Manx Radio, I think, lost his job because he uttered the phrase, "all lives matter." I mean, this is preposterous. Saying all lives matter does not imply that black lives do not matter. It embraces black lives. But you say that anywhere nowadays, and you are therefore described as a racist, and it's wrong. The trans debate is another one, which I have to say I'm reluctant to dip my toes into, because I've seen what happens when you do, and therefore I've been silenced on it. And I think I'm as entitled to a view on that as anybody else. But I've seen what happened to J.K. Rowling, and I'm not equating myself with her, but I've seen what happened to Suzanne Moore. I write about that in the book. And it's terrible that you are not allowed to say anymore that women deserve to have the safe spaces, I hate that phrase anyway, safe spaces that they have fought for decades, if not centuries. And there are occasions when a man with a penis should not be in the same room as a woman. It's just, I mean, I don't understand why people can't understand that. And I don't think it is right that I should be able to just sign a piece of paper saying I'm a woman. I just don't think that that is the right thing to do. Now, if somebody wants to transition and become a woman, absolutely, I have absolutely no problem at all in describing them as a woman. And I've done, over the years, I've done phone-ins where I've talked to trans men and trans women, and I would not want to go through the psychological traumas that they've had to go through in their lives. And you can't really, I think people say, well, coming out as gay can be very difficult for many people, and it absolutely can. But I can't really put myself in the position of somebody who wants to actually change their sex. And I think that's probably typical. That doesn't mean to say that I can't have empathy with them, that I can't have compassion, and I certainly don't want society to sort of other them, because I remember the first time I did this, it must have been right in my early days at LBC. It was one of those subjects where I was, I suppose, slightly uncomfortable. I thought, who's going to phone in? And I just remember asking trans women in particular to phone in. And I went to Nicola in Brentwood. That genuinely was her name. And I said, "Hi Nicola, what would you like to say?" "Hello Ian." And of course you instantly think, well, that's not what I was expecting. And then she described her life in a normal English town, and it was a daily hell. And you think, well, that takes some courage. That really does take some courage to live your life that way. But you know that you were not meant to be in the body that you were born in. So I have huge compassion there. I won't say tolerance, because I always think tolerance is a really weird word. It implies that you're tolerating someone, but you don't really like them or approve of them. So I try to avoid that word. But it is such a difficult area, because no one should feel that they shouldn't be able to say something. I mean, I should feel free to say that I'm proud of my country. But if I do that now, you're considered a nationalist.
It's interesting, there are certain topics that you just can't talk about unless you're Iain Dale or some people with radio shows on LBC and things like that. You know, I'm talking about grooming gangs and very touchy subjects, and you've touched on some really difficult topics.
Yeah, but even with subjects, even those sorts of things, I'm constantly accused nowadays of becoming lefty and woke. And I always ask people, well, how do you come to that conclusion? Give me something that I've said or done that is different from what I would have said or done 5 years ago. And today, I can't find anybody giving me actual examples. I've always been pro-immigration. I've never pretended that I'm a sort of anti-immigration right-winger. I'm just not. And I remember saying during the Brexit referendum, if you think that Brexit is going to reduce immigration, think again. Because if you think Brexit is going to be successful and the economy is going to grow, Therefore, we need more people to do just. Where do you think we're going to get them from? They're not all going to be in this country. And to my mind, immigration has always been driven by economic needs rather than anything else, and always will be. But on the grooming gangs issue, I mean, I've talked about that loads of times, but if you look at Twitter, you'll think that I'd ignored it completely. I have specifically said, live on radio, we have a problem with people from a British Pakistani heritage who seem to think that this sort of thing is okay. Now, I remember the first time I said that thinking, I'm probably going to get into trouble for that. Not with my bosses, but just generally. I didn't. But I can say it till I'm blue in the face, and people still think that, oh no, he tiptoes around that. He won't call a spade and say what the actual problem is. I've done phone-ins on it. I've had people from that background ring me to say, thank God you've said that. You're absolutely right. We're from that background. We know there's a problem, and something's got to be done about it. And I've said, yeah. People from your background have actually got to make sure that this doesn't happen. This can't be something that the government can legislate on particularly. It is a cultural, it's not a racial thing, it's a cultural thing. But you're right, it is very difficult to, and unless you bang on about it constantly and do something like literally every week, people are always going to think that, oh, because he because he sounds so nice and reasonable, therefore he can't have said anything controversial about this issue. And you get to the point where you can talk till you're blue in the face and you're not going to convince anybody.
Well, you're never going to please everyone, and there's always going to be those people who you know.
And that's the thing, that if you do the kind of job I do, you have to recognise that right from the start. I mean, I like to be liked. I'm sure you like to be liked. Why would anyone thrive on being hated unless you're Kelvin Mackenzie or somebody like that? But wanting to be liked does not mean that you have to bow down to people. You have to be able to articulate your case and let people form their own judgments. And I think, given that I talk for 3 hours a night on subjects which often I don't know an awful lot about, I know I can argue much better now than I could 10 years ago. And if I go on any questions or question time, it doesn't faze me. I used to be incredibly nervous because it's a great opportunity to make a complete fool of yourself. And I would watch these programs, and an audience member would ask a question, and I would think to myself, God, what would I say? I don't know what I'd say. Oh, I can't go on that program. But of course, when you do, the adrenaline flows, and I've never had an occasion where I've just dried up, thank God, because that really would be embarrassing. But even on subjects literally where I know nothing about them or I'm not even interested in them, because I've learned how to argue, I can put forward some sort of reasonable case.
You're always, not just you, but some people in question time are always very good at pivoting onto something that they do know about or do have an opinion about if the question comes up.
Yeah, that's not a very good way to do it because people word that out very quickly. I remember the first time I went on question time, Piers Morgan texted me. I think he'd seen that it was my first appearance, and he just texted me. And he said, whatever you do, as soon as you start speaking, address the question. You can go off on tangents afterwards, but people think, oh, he's actually answering the question, because so few people do. And one of my techniques, certainly on any questions, was in the warm-up question before you go on air, make the audience laugh, because then you've kind of got them on your, even if they're like die-hard left-wingers, they think, oh, he's all right. And you can get them on your side. And I only realised about 5 or 6 weeks ago I was on Any Questions. But of course, I was doing it from my sofa in Norfolk, not in the sort of drafty school hall in front of an audience. And I didn't enjoy it. I realised then how important a live audience is to me in those situations, where you can really bounce off an audience. And of course, if you're sitting on your sofa with your dogs by the side of you, it's an entirely different vibe.
Thanks so much, Iain Dale, for joining us.
Thank you.